Hey there, it is time to talk about reproduction in flowering plants. Now, before we get started on that, can you label the parts of a flower? Take a minute, pause the video, see what you can do. Are you ready to check your work? Let's see how you did. This one right here is the petal. This piece right here, anther, filament, sepal, stigma, style, ovary, and nectary. Do you know which are male and female? Well, on this side, we have the anther and the filament, which make the stamen. So the stamen has two pieces, anther and filament, and that's the male part. It contains the genetic code from the male part of the plant. And over here, we have the carpel, which has three parts, stigma, style, and ovary, and that's the female part, and that's where the fruit and the seeds are made. Okay. Now, pollination is just the transfer of pollen from an anther to the stigma. And this pollen can be transferred by the wind, by insects or animals, and it could be from any plant out there. So if you have a bumblebee visiting a great big field of flowers like we have out here in Arizona, that pollen could have come from any plant in that field or in that area, okay? So when we look at these flowers, what do you notice? What's the difference, or how are they the same, these flowers that you see on this screen? Well, the one on the left are pollinated by insects, and the one on the right are pollinated by wind. Take a moment and think about why that is, why these would be that way. All right, let's talk about it. So their adaptations, the way they look, they're adapted to the way that they get pollinated. So when you're looking at an insect or animal pollinated flower, they're usually very bright. They have a very sweet smell for the most part. They're what we carry around in bouquets. They are designed to attract animals to help them be pollinated. When you talk about wind-pollinated flowers, these are plants that, like trees and different grasses and weeds, that rely on the wind to pick up their seeds and carry them away, and pick up their pollen and carry it away. Wind-pollinated plants make millions and trillions of little tiny pollens so that the wind can carry them away. Flowers still create a lot of pollen, but they're usually very small and they're sticky, and they don't need as many because as long as there's a bee or a bird around, they know that it's going to get carried from plant to plant. So they don't need quite as many, okay? These are actual photos of wind-pollinated flowers or plants. So you look right here, this is off of a tree, and in the Midwest, we see these a lot, that you could actually shake it and the pollen just falls down. It coats your windshield in this yellow, dusty film. And then we have some flowers, and you can see right here this feathery area that's out there trying to collect the pollen from the air itself. So when we look at this picture of microscopic pollens, do you see which ones would be for the wind and which ones would be waiting for an animal to pick it up? Well, these ones with the spikies are like Velcro, okay? They're designed to stick to things. So those would be the insect or animal pollinator pollens, okay? And these little round ones are super light and smooth so that the wind can pick them up and carry them away to their new home. So there's different kinds of pollination, okay? So we've got wind pollinators and we've got insect pollinating, and there's different types of pollination. So we have self-pollination, where the pollen itself comes from the flower that was right there, okay? It's the bee bumped into the anther and just went and gave it right back to the flower it came from. That's also the same for flowers that are on the same plant. That's still self-pollination. This cross-pollination happens more often when you're in like a big field of flowers, and so bees jump from plant to plant to plant, or hummingbirds or bats or whatever animal happens to be there. That cross-pollination is when it comes from one flower to another. And then we have artificial pollination, and people who are into botany and trying to make very specific color combinations and keep different plant species alive, they might do some artificial pollination, but we're more interested in these self-pollination and cross-pollination techniques. You do need to copy this chart into your notebook. Take a moment and think, what would you put into these spaces, okay? Hopefully these match what you would say, but you do need to know these. This is an important chart. You need to be able to look at it and see how they're the same, but they're still different. Want to point out that nectaries are completely absent in wind pollinated flowers, and that is because nectaries are made full of nectar, which is just basically sugar water on the basic scale of things. And the wind does not care if something tastes sweet. So they don't need them at all, okay? When we talk about pollen tubes, so if we look right here, a plant has been dissected. So we have a pollen grain at the top and a pollen tube. This is a microscopic picture of that exact thing. So basically what happens is after landing on the stigma, a long pollen tube grows out of the pollen grain and down to the style, to the ovary, okay? So the nucleus of the pollen grain then moves down the pollen tube. Fertilization takes place when the pollen nucleus, the male gamete, fuses in the ovule nucleus with the female gamete to form a zygote. Now that zygote becomes a fruit, seed pod, which is a type of fruit, anything that, is going to join those genetic materials together, because this is a type of sexual reproduction. So you have a male gamete, you have a female gamete. When it comes together, it makes that zygote. So all living things need to reproduce, and plants are just like that, okay? You need to understand that a pollen tube is only there after pollen attaches to the stigma to travel down the style, okay? And you'll notice in this picture that there's a pollen tube starting to grow here, but this piece of pollen, maybe it came from a different plant, and so the genetic code doesn't match up, so the pollen tube's not going to grow all the way. The only pollen tube that's going to grow all the way is if it's from the same type of flower. So a rose is only going to pollinate a rose, okay? So if this were a tulip pollen, it's not going to be able to make a pollen tube to complete that process of fertilization. So pollination is pollen going from the anther to the stigma. Fertilization is when the male gamete meets the female gamete to form a zygote. So that happens in the ovule, okay? So there's two separate processes that you need to know. And here are two just different diagrams that had really great pictures and labels and kind of were easy to understand and read, okay? So if you have any questions, look through your books, ask for help, do some research.